Good evening and welcome to Adult Storytime from the Saskatoon Public Library. My name is Jim and tonight is a kind of a special night. Not kind of, it is a special night. It's Orange Shirt Day that has the slogan, "Every Child Matters." And in particular, it's to honor the survivors of the residential school system that existed in Canada up until, I think, 1996. I think the last one was in Saskatchewan in the Capel Valley, if I'm not mistaken. It was a system that was meant to assimilate First Nations people into Canadian culture. At least that was its stated purpose. And the idea is to eradicate First Nations culture, whatever it might be, in all parts of Canada, because of course First Nations culture isn't a homogenous thing. It's thousands of different cultures and languages and so on that existed at the time, and still do in many places across Canada. So the idea was to take children, mostly forcibly, or through some sort of coercion, out of their family, out of their culture, away from their language, and to make them into Christians and give them an education. Quite often, these schools were, they were all religious schools, so to speak. They were all run by various churches, and the teachers, often nuns, sometimes brothers, priests, etc., were ill-trained as teachers. They had very little education themselves. Some of them were, frankly, illiterate. Mostly what the kids did, the young children, was to maintain the school by cleaning and etc., 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 cooking, you name it, they did it. And there was very little education in there. There was, of course, quite a bit of religious education where they were told that they were, frankly, savages, and that the only way they could hope to get to heaven, or at least the white man's heaven, was to pray and pray and pray and acknowledge that their previous ways, their ways that they'd been brought up in, were wrong. Anyway, I could go on and on. It's an amazingly grotesque history, and very little good can be said of it. The book I've chosen for you is called Fatty Legs, and it happens way up north, north of Tuktoyaktuk. It was written jointly by Margaret Pokiak-Fenton, who was a residential school attendee, and her daughter-in-law. Some lovely illustrations. It's more of a book of defiance against residential schools than anything else. And I'm not going to read you the whole book. I'm just going to read sections of it with the hope that you go get the book from the library. We have copies. Or you can even buy it, right? It's been in publication since 2010, continuously, right up until today. Turns out it's a very popular book, and hopefully the sections I read to you, you'll see why, and you'll be interested in reading it. Before I start doing that, I really have to talk about my own experience of residential schools, because really, what you should do, frankly, is stop this video and go listen to the many recordings that we have made, the public library has made, of First Nations people who actually experienced, just like in this book, residential schools firsthand. Because, as you can see, I'm a white guy. It's kind of why I wore the white t-shirt underneath this orange shirt. My knowledge of residential schools, and frankly the treatment of First Nations people in my country, only started really a number of years ago. I'm 65 years old now. And I started to think back when my first awareness of the troubles that First Nations people have had in my country, or in North America for that matter, or anywhere in the world. And I went right back to where I was brought up, which is Winnipeg, Manitoba. I was born in 1955, and I spent, I think right up until the age of 13, I spent in Winnipeg. And then my folks and me and my sisters, we subsequently moved to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, where I spent my teenage years, and then finally I went off elsewhere for other kinds of education. And it occurred to me that where I grew up in Winnipeg, my father was a mining engineer, so we were sort of upper middle class, if you will. I lived in a neighborhood that didn't have a single First Nations family living in it. None of the schools I went to, the elementary school, the junior high I went to, there were no First Nations people in those schools. When I moved to Saskatoon, it was the same thing. In my neighborhood, there were no First Nations people living. And the high school I went to, the same thing. There wasn't a single First Nations person going to school there. In fact, I can't remember almost any other kind of ethnicity other than European in my entire time. My whole knowledge of First Nations people was through, television shows and movies. So mostly apocryphal notions of First Nations people. That's what I grew up on. And why is that? Well, the residential school system and the Indian Act and all of the things that our governments, which means us, have done to separate First Nations people from white European culture was quite successful during the 50s and 60s and well into the 70s. Ironically, the first First Nation person I ever met and sat down and had a talk with was when I was 20. I had taken a trip to Arizona where I met some family friends, and I was introduced, one of the people I met was an artist who introduced me to a number of First Nations people, particularly Charles Loehmann, who was a celebrated silversmith, a Sumi Indian who lived in Arizona. And we spent a couple of days with this gentleman, who is a very funny, lovely man. He's unfortunately no longer with us, who was a historian of First Nations people and culture and so on in North America. And it was the first time I heard some of the truth of what happened between First Nations folks and European settlers and so on, businesses and so on that came to this country and to North America. And it was shocking, unbelievable even. I won't go into the details of what he said, but it mostly did point out that it was, I was 20 before I actually spent some time with a First Nations person. Which I find very sad, although I suspect the government thought was very successful, or culture at large, the Canadian culture at large, found it very successful. And I think even some people think, wouldn't it be good to go back to those times? My childhood was idyllic. I never had to suffer the privations of what Margaret Pokiak-Fenton or anybody that attended a residential school had to suffer. The pains, the horribleness. There's a lovely quote. Margaret only spent 2 years, fortunately, in a residential school. But many people spent many years in various schools. There's one quote I read was, I spent 5 years in a residential school, and when I came out, it was like being hung in between two walls. One wall was my culture, my First Nations culture, my family, all of the things that I knew were gone. I'd forgotten them or whatever, and they didn't recognize me. So I was a stranger to that community But on this other hand was white culture, who also did not accept me, did not recognize me as a human being. So there I hung in between those two worlds. I was completely alone. I've never experienced anything like that. Ever. The world was made for me. And, I never walk into a store now or ever, even when during the 60s I had quite long hair. I was kind of a hippie-ish boy. Nobody ever followed me around the store to see if I'd steal something. I was welcomed wherever I went. Yeah, not only was I white, but I was also male, which also has all kinds of privilege attached to it and so on. So anyway, just now, well, probably in the last 20 years particularly, I have gained some education in this regard. And hopefully I'm doing some good. I don't know. And I think this is important, that you be introduced to especially these testimonies of people that have been through this, because we still live, very much so, live with the consequences of the abuses that happened in residential schools. Because those people that went to those residential schools came out of those places damaged. And they had children and families and passed that damage along because they really had no choice. Anyway, Margaret Pokiak-Fenton and Fatty Legs. I'm just going to read the first chapter and maybe a couple of selections inside, and hopefully you find it interesting. And go out and read the book. All right, let's go. So I'm going to read the first chapter to you of Fatty Legs. And it goes like this. When I was a young girl, outsiders came flitting about the north. They plucked us from our homes on the scattered islands of the Arctic Ocean and carried us back to the nests they called schools in Aklavik. 3 times I had made the 5-day journey to Aklavik with my father, across the open ocean, past Tuktoyaktuk, and through the tangled Mackenzie Delta, to buy supplies. I was mesmerized on each trip by the spectacle of the strange, dark-cloaked nuns whose tongues flickered with French-Canadian accents, and the pale-skinned priests who had traveled across a different ocean from a far-off land called Belgium. They held the key to the greatest of the outsiders' mysteries, reading. My older half-sister had been plucked before I was born. We called her Rosie after her return. She would tell me nothing about the school tucked away in the maze of the Delta, where she had gone for 4 years. But when I was 7, she did read to me from a collection of beautifully colored books my father had given her for Christmas. The stories were precious treasures to be enjoyed in the well-lit, toasty warmth of our smoke-scented tent, as the darkness of winter was constant, and the temperatures outside were cold enough to freeze bare skin in seconds. The books were written in English, so I understood very little of them. I was always left with many unanswered questions. "What's a rabbit?" I asked Rosie in our language. "Well, it's like a hare," she told me, lifting her eyes from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Oh, well, why did Alice follow it down the hole? To hunt it?" Rosie gave me a funny look. "No, Loehmann. She followed it because she was curious." I tried to imagine being Alice as the large cook stove crackled behind me. She was brave to go into a long, dark tunnel, all for curiosity. "What was it like?" Rosie looked up from the book again. "What was what like?" "The outsider's school." "I don't know. You ask too many questions." Her face grew dark in the light of the coal oil lamp. She closed the book and looked away. Well, it must have been exciting to live with the outsiders. She shrugged her shoulders and dropped the book on the table. But they taught you how to read. Rosie was silent. Please, I begged, tugging at her legs as she got up from the table and slipped on her parka. They cut our hair because our mothers weren't there to braid it for us. I don't need my mother to braid my hair. I can do it myself. They'd cut it anyway. They always cut the little one's hair. Well, I'm not that little. They don't care. They don't have the patience to wait for you to braid your hair. They want all of your time for chores and for kneeling on your knees to ask forgiveness. Oh, well, it's only hair. Oh, it isn't just your hair, Loehmann. They take everything. Well, can you at least finish reading me the story? Rosie gave me an icy look. You want to know about the school so much? You can go there and learn to read for yourself. She turned, pulled apart the flap of the tent door, and disappeared through the tunnel in the snow that formed the entrance to our home. I ran after her down the dark corridor, but she was already gone into the pitch-black afternoon of the Arctic winter. She knew that our father would not let me go to school. He had told the outsiders no. The past 4 summers they had come for me. Rosie was lucky that her aunt had allowed her to go. One day at the end of February 1944, when the sun had just begun to return to the sky, my father took me hunting with him. We traveled by dog sled for several hours until we came to a place where game was plentiful. Father, I said when we finally stopped, can I go to school this year? No, he said. But you and Rosie both went, and I will be 8 in June when the ice melts. He raised his hand, silencing me, and motioned for me to return to the dog sled. Atop a distant hill stood a wolf, its silhouette stark in the afternoon twilight. My father had it in the sights of his rifle, shot cracks through the air, killing my chance to convince him. When he returned to the dog sled with the wolf carcass, his knit brow, hard eyes told me that he was finished discussing the matter. I cringed under the cold flash of defeat, but I was careful not to talk any further about my desire to go to school. Instead, I held it inside all through the long months that followed. My father rarely spoke of the school, and would never tell me of the wonderful things I could learn there. He was a smart man who loved to read, but he put little value in the outsiders' learning compared to the things that our people knew. But my heart would not give up hope. I climbed the cemetery hill and stared out over the sleeping, stone-still water each day, waiting for the sea to come alive with waves. Sometimes I brought the book with me, the one about the girl named Alice who followed the hare-like creature down the burrow. I looked at the pictures and remembered the tea party she had had, and how her body had become small, large again, but I still did not know what happened to her at the end of that burrow. Did she catch the hare? In late May, when the sun stood constant watch in the sky and night traversed it only briefly like the shadow of a passing bird's wing, I found my father preparing the hides of animals he had collected from his trapline. I knew the topic was forbidden, but I could not silence my heart another day. I asked him once again to allow me to go to school. The outsiders do not teach you how to hunt, he said, pointing his knife at the fox he was about to skin. They only use your knowledge of making snares for their own profit and send you to gather the animals from their trap lines. They do not teach you how to cure meat and clean fish so that you can live off the land. They feed you cabbage soup and porridge. They do not teach you how to make parkas and kamek, he said, eyeing the beautifully crafted delta braid on my parka and the embroidered fur-lined boots on my feet. They make you wear their scratchy outsiders' clothes, which keep out neither the mosquitoes nor the cold. They teach you their songs and dances instead of your own, and they tell you what the spirit inside of you. They tell you that the spirit inside of you is bad and needs their forgiveness. I had already learned a lot about hunting, trapping, and curing foods. My friend Agnes, who was 10, had already gone to the school. She told me that the nuns made you sew all the time. It would not be difficult to learn to sew parkas and kamek if I was used to sewing all of the time anyway. And how could I ever forget our songs and our dances? They were a part of me. But I had once heard the outsiders' beautiful chants resonating from the church in Tuktoyaktuk, and I had dreamed of learning to make such music. I would be careful to stay out of trouble, and no one would say I had to kneel and ask for forgiveness. They would see that my spirit was good. I would be patient, but I would not give up. I would wait and ask my father again. Time melted away. My 8th birthday came and went. The sea began to wake from its slumber, and I knew it would not be long before the ice broke from the shore and was carried out to be swallowed by the ocean. Soon all of us, my father and the other hunters and trappers, along with their families, would leave our winter home on Banks Island to carry boatloads of pelts to Alklavik. The outsiders had many islands to scour for children during the short summer season, and ours was a long distance from Alklavik. As it was so far from them to travel, it was unlikely that they would be there when they came, that we would be there when they came. Try that again. Now, the outsiders had many islands to scour for children during the short summer season, and ours was a long distance from Aklavik. As it was so far for them to travel, it was unlikely that they would be there when they came, that we would be there when they came. My father was my only hope. One day in late June, I looked up from staring at the book I was so desperate to read and saw that the enormous splintering chunks of ice had left enough of a gap to allow us passage. I slammed the book shut, sped down the hill, and ran along the rocky shore as fast as I could, which was fast because my legs were muscular and strong. I was determined and ready to ask again, Father, please, can I go to school this year? I huffed in heavy breaths, darting to the small groups of men who were loading the schooners for the journey. My father heaved a bale of white fox pelts over the edge of the North Star. His answer had not changed. No. Please, you can drop me at Aklavik when you go for supplies. My father paused to swat a mosquito. He looked into my eyes. You are a stubborn girl, and the outsiders do not like stubborn children. Please, I said again. Please. He crouched to my height, and he picked up a rock with one of his hands and held it out to me. Do you see this rock? It was once jagged and full of sharp, jutting points, but the water of the ocean slapped and slapped at it, carrying away its angles and edges. Now it is nothing but a small pebble. That is what the outsiders will do to you at the school. But Father, the water did not change the stone inside the rock. I am not a rock. I am a girl. I can move. I am not stuck upon the shore for eternity. You are a clever one, he said, touching my cheek and then looking down at the book in my hand. Does that mean I can go? My hope blossomed, billowing beneath my parka. He looked deep into my eyes, the rock held tightly in his fist. I suppose it's the only way I will hear the end of it. Oh, I turned to run and tell my mother the news, but my father reached for me and pulled me in. He held me in his arms for a long time. The fur of his parka pressed against my face so that I could hardly breathe. When he finally let go, I did not give him a single moment to change his mind. Even faster than I had run to the shore, I ran back to my mother, who was in our tent packing up the belongings we would need for the journey. Mother, I shouted as I rushed through the entrance. Father says I can go to school this year. She did not say a word. Instead, she set my little sister down on a caribou hide, pushed past me out of the tent, and headed straight for him. I could tell she did not think it was such terrific news. That's the end of the first chapter. So what resonates for me, I work in a library. Reading is good. Every child should learn how to read, I'd say, if normally asked. But in this case, I'm reading this and going, please don't go. Please don't go. Is this book worth the fact that she learned how to read? Is any book worth that? For what she had to go through to get that knowledge from us people? Anyway. So here's a few other selections. So Margaret Loehmann had got her wish. And so when her father and the rest of her family traveled to Aklavik to sell his furs from the winter before, she went too, but this time to go to the school, the residential school. And she was very excited. All thoughts of the warnings that had been given to her completely forgotten. And but she soon found out that it was a different place than she thought. Her hair was cut. She was given bad clothing, and all her stuff was taken away. And worst of all, she realized she wouldn't be learning anything for the summer. She'd just be doing chores, cleaning, mending, gardening, and so on. She would have to wait till fall for that to start. So I'm going to read you chapter 4 is when that first fall that she started to, actually go to school, so to speak. And by this time she had met the Raven. Was the first nun anyway, that she met from the school, that had taken her away from her parents without even allowing her to say goodbye. And the nun she called the Raven. We never find out her actual name, but Raven fits. Quite a cruel woman. So I'm going to read you the chapter when they start to learn. The Raven is her teacher, so to speak. And let's just read that chapter. The summer took an eternity to pass, but eventually it did. I was working outside one day when the last of the outsiders' boats returned to Aklavik, carrying both freshly plucked children and those they had regathered. We saw them make their way past us, where we knelt in the garden. We will start classes tomorrow, Agnes told me. Agnes, by the way, is her cousin, who has been attending the school for, I believe, 2 years by this point. I felt like dancing around the potatoes. But the Raven was watching me, and I didn't dare. Walking into the classroom the next morning, I stood as straight as I could. I was hoping to impress Sister McQuillan. Now, I should explain that Sister McQuillan was the nun who ran this particular school and was fairly kind, and had shown her some protection previous to this from the Raven and some of the Raven's excesses when it came to discipline and learning. And she'd been told, or so she thought, that Sister McQuillan was the one that was going to teach them. So walking into the classroom the next morning, I stood as straight as I could. I was hoping to impress Sister McQuillan, but I was in for a shock. The kind nun wasn't there. It was the Raven who hovered behind the large wooden desk, where Sister McQuillan should have been. How could the Raven be my teacher? A smile shrank from my face as I squeezed into the small desk that she pointed me to. Unfortunately, it was right in front of hers. After all of the other children had been seated, she let out a croak. By now, most of us who were new had become very good at following the cues of the older girls. We had even learned a few phrases of English. Each of us found a reader inside of our desk. We pulled the books out and set them before us. The Raven rose from her seat, closing in on me, and pointed a yardstick in my direction, motioning me to stand. "She wants you to read aloud," whispered Agnes from the seat behind me. I rose to my feet, but how was I to read? I didn't even know which page to turn to. The raven cocked her hip and tapped a foot. "Well?" My cheeks felt hot. I looked around me from child to child. The faces stared back, blank, waiting as my stockings began to slide down my calves. The Gwich'in girl raised her hand high in the air. "Catherine," acknowledged the nun. She rose and started reading aloud from her own schoolbook. The raven raised a wing-like arm, silencing Catherine. She turned back to me and pointed her finger to the ground. The other children giggled. "You can sit down now," Agnes said in a soft voice. How did the raven expect us to learn without speaking to us in our own language, so that we could understand? My first reading lesson had not been what I had anticipated. I was grateful when it was over, and I launched myself from my desk, eager to follow the others out to play. But the raven stopped me. She put a brush in my hand and pointed to the colossal chalkboards. I gave her a questioning look. I did not know why she was making me stay to clean them. She answered with something in English that, of course, I didn't understand. And my older classmates cried with laughter as they left the room. Later, I stopped Agnes in the hall. "What did the teacher say that made the others laugh at the end of the class?" "She said that cleaning the boards should be no problem for you because you are so tall your stockings won't even stay up." "She has it in for me. I know she does." "Who?" asked a lyrical voice, and in our own language. It was Sister McQuillan. We had not noticed that we were standing in front of her office. "No one, sister," answered Agnes in English before tugging me down the hall. The raven thought she knew a lot, but she cared more about making us do chores than about teaching us. She said that chores were part of our education. For some reason, she seemed to think that I needed more of an education than the others, and as the weeks went by, I was forever mopping the floors, tidying the recreation room, and emptying the honey buckets. Do I need to tell you what a honey bucket is? I wasn't sure what she meant to teach me, but I had something to teach her about the spirit of us Inuit. One evening in October, after a hard day of the raven's education, I sat over my bowl of cabbage soup in the long dining hall, watching the other children eat. It was the same food we had been force-fed when we first arrived, and I remembered how many girls had become ill. Those same girls now were lapping it up because they were starving. It made me angry. How could they expect us to eat this meatless mush? My father's sled dogs would not have licked the bowl it was put in. My stomach hurt, but that night I refused to touch it to my lips. "Perhaps you need help with your appetite," suggested the raven as she dropped a soppy wet rag right in my lap. She didn't have to say another word. By now I knew that she intended for me to wipe down all of the tables. Such was life for Margaret in the school. But she buckled down. She became a very good student, despite the raven. Instead of playing the small recreation times that they did get, she would spend time trying to figure out the words and books and so on. And she planned not to spend another year in the place. She would go back with her family when they arrived to sell their furs and so on in the spring. So here's a section about what happened after that first year. When the first boats began to appear, I could hardly believe the time had come. It would not be long before my parents arrived. However, on one of those boats was a letter from my father. The North Star, along with the other schooners, had not made it home to Banks. Try that again. When the first boats began to appear, I could hardly believe the time had come. It would not be long before my parents arrived. However, on one of the boats was a letter from my father. The North Star, along with the other schooners, had not made it home to Banks Island the summer before. They had been stranded on a smaller island by an early freeze. The hunting and trapping had not been as successful there, and the entire group had decided to do their trading in Tuktoyaktuk instead of coming all the way to Aklavik, for fear of being caught by the ice again. I was devastated. This could not be happening. By now I could read and knew my times tables as well as Catherine, and I was ready to go home. It was time, and my parents were not going to come for me. Not sure if they would ever come for me. I cried until the letter was soaked with tears. It tore in my hands. That night I had a nightmare. I dreamed I was locked beneath the raven's habit with many other children. She cackled and laughed as we tried to break free, straining against its weight, knowing that we would never see our parents again. Outside, men competed in athletics and women gossiped, and everyone sang and danced and shared the stories of our ancestors, while I delivered meals to the sick patients in the hospital. It did not take me long to discover that being a nurse was not the glamorous job I had imagined. I would have given anything to be with my people, eating dry meat and muktuk, delicious tiny cubes of whale blubber and skin. If I could not go home or even to the games, the least the nuns could do was continue to teach me, but of course they did not. It was summer. While I was not the only child who did not go home that summer, I was lonely without Agnes. She was able to return home to her family as they were now living in Tuktoyaktuk. The nuns did their very best not to return any of us. Keeping us at the school was an easy way to ensure that we would return each fall, which was important to them. It wasn't just the chores. They were paid by the government per student, and plucking us from our homes and keeping us in their nests was a money-making business. I'm just going to read one more thing to show you a little bit about the defiance of our young friend Margaret here. After the summer, she was almost pleased to be back into the clutches of the raven, because it would mean that she would perhaps learn more things. However, that didn't happen. They had a smallpox thing happen in the so the summer was long, lots of hard work. Don't forget, she was 8 when she arrived, and so she'd be 9 now. They'll be basically slave child labor. Anyway, the fall came, and she was very pleased because it meant that she would perhaps, get a little more education. But that was not to be, because they had a smallpox thing came through, and so they all the students that were there worked in the hospital until late November, when finally it subsided. As people became well again in late November, classes resumed. By then I had read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland 4 times. Rosie had been telling the truth. Alice had not been hunting the rabbit at all. I would have brought its pelt back to my father. One day the raven entered the classroom and told us that we would write letters home to our parents. I could hardly restrain myself in my seat. Not only did I long to make my father proud by telling him all that I had learned and about all the books I had read, but I wanted to ask him to come for me the next time the sun returned to melt the ice. We dipped our pens in our inkwells and wrote, Dear Mother and Father, as instructed. For most of the students, the exercise Try that again. As people became well again in late November, classes resumed. By then, I had read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland 4 times. Rosie had been telling the truth. Alice had not been hunting the rabbit at all. I would have brought its pelt back from my father. One day, the raven entered the classroom and told us that we would write letters home to our parents. I could hardly restrain myself in my seat. Not only did I long to make my father proud by telling him all that I had learned and about all the books I had read, but I wanted to ask him to come for me the next time the sun returned to melt the ice. We dipped our pens in our inkwells and wrote, Dear Mother and Father, as instructed. For most of the students, the exercise was almost pointless. Many of their parents were unable to read English, just as my mother could not. Next, we were told to write, I love it here at the school. The nuns have been very kind to us. Kind? That was a stretch. Instead, I wrote, Dear Mother and Father, I hate this school. You were right. The food is awful and the nuns are very mean. They won't even let me wear the stockings you bought for me. As you can see, I have already learned to read and write. Please come get me as soon as you can. I am ready to go home. Love, Loehmann. I did not hear the rest of what the raven dictated, but it didn't matter. I had written everything that I needed to say. I passed my letter to the front with the others. Now all I had to do was wait, or so I thought. 2 days later, the raven called me to the desk. This is not what you were told to write, she said, tearing my letter in half and throwing it in the trash can. Now write it again so it reads like this. She handed me a slip of paper to copy from. The other children were dismissed to go and play in the recreation room, but I was held back to write my letter. I stared at the ceiling and imagined I was bundled in hides, safe in my father's dog sled, whizzing through a snowy valley of white. I counted the stars and watched the northern lights dance, frost clinging to my nostrils. Sister McQuillan glimpsed me through the door as she floated by. She stopped, stepped into the room, and looked over my shoulder. It's all right, Margaret, she said. You may go to dinner now. The raven scowled at me when I handed in my letter. All I had written was, Dear Mother and Father. She would have held me there all night had it not been for Sister McQuillan, but it would not have mattered. Nothing could make me write that I loved the school. I found a seat next to Agnes in the refectory. What's wrong, she asked. The raven won't let me send a letter to my parents asking them to come and get me. Don't worry. I overheard 2 nuns talking today. Next week we are going over to CHAK to broadcast a message to our parents. You can tell them then. So these children were herded off to a radio station, and they were allowed to broadcast messages to their parents. But as she mentioned before, a lot of these parents didn't even speak English. And of course, they had to do the broadcast in English. And of course, the raven went with them, and it was prescribed what they were to say. And if they didn't say what they were told to say, the transmission would be cut. So what did Loehmann do? Well, this is what she did. She stood in front of the microphone after being introduced and said nothing. Oh, she paid dearly for that. It's true. But she did it anyway. So that's all I'm going to read to you from this lovely book, Fatty Legs. I hope you enjoyed it. I didn't even get into the subject of the red stockings. That's for you to read, I think, to read it from beginning to end. There's also some great information about residential schools at the end. Just a great book altogether. So yeah, Fatty Legs by Margaret Fenton. But just remember fatty legs. You can find the book. All right? Thanks very much for listening. And again, go listen to the people who actually experienced this. We have recordings of what people thought about residential schools who actually attended them. And I believe there's some from people who didn't actually attend them, but their parents did, and the effect that it had on their lives much later on, right till today. Yeah. Okay? Have a great evening.